When we examine the records of early complex societies, we are confronted with two primary and often conflicting streams of data. On one hand, we have the archaeological evidence of their physical world, on the other, the textual evidence of their symbolic world. A recurring methodological problem emerges when I juxtapose these two datasets. The stratified layers of settlement frequently point to systemic rupture, abrupt reorganizations in architecture, sudden shifts in material culture, and evidence of large-scale societal collapse. Conversely, the textual traditions originating from these same periods often construct a narrative of profound continuity. These records, whether administrative or mythological, work to legitimize the existing power structure by anchoring it to a stable, preordained, and often ancient authority. This creates a critical disalignment between what is excavated and what is written. The investigative question, then, is not which account is more accurate. The more urgent problem is functional. What is the purpose of a narrative of unbroken order in a world defined by material discontinuity? My analysis, therefore, does not seek to reconcile these sources. Instead, it focuses on the structure of this very conflict. I will investigate how the concept of an inherited world is textually engineered to manage the memory of collapse and to provide a blueprint for civilizational restart. The stratified occupation layers at sites like Eridu and Uruk in southern Mesopotamia provide the initial concrete data for my investigation. When I examine the vertical sequence of these ancient cities, I am not looking at a single moment in time, but at a deep history compressed into layers of earth. Each stratum represents a distinct phase of settlement, a physical record of construction, use, and eventual abandonment or destruction. My analysis begins by mapping the material culture contained within these layers, treating them as a timeline of societal organization built one upon the other over millennia. What I observe within the archaeological sequence at these settlements are abrupt reorganizations of urban space. The layout of public buildings and residential quarters does not evolve smoothly. Instead, I find evidence of entire districts being razed and rebuilt on entirely new alignments. This pattern extends beyond architecture. The technological assemblages, such as ceramic typologies and tool manufacturing techniques, also exhibit sudden shifts. A specific pottery style, dominant for centuries, might abruptly disappear from a layer, replaced by a completely different tradition. These changes in the material culture do not appear to follow a continuous linear transition from one phase to the next. The archaeological record lacks the expected intermediate forms that would signal a gradual evolution of techniques or a slow adaptation of social structures. The absence of these transitional phases presents a significant methodological problem. It suggests that the model of slow organic development may not accurately describe the historical trajectory of these early urban centers. We are confronted with evidence of sharp, punctuated change. This recurring pattern of discontinuity in the physical record points towards something more profound than isolated events. The scale and synchronicity of these shifts across multiple sites may indicate recurring systemic breaks in the broader organization of Mesopotamian society. The central question that emerges from this physical evidence is therefore one of memory and continuity. If the material world of these societies was subject to periodic collapse and radical reorganization, how was a coherent cultural and political identity maintained across these ruptures? To address this problem of material rupture, I now turn to a parallel dataset, the cuneiform textual record. My focus is on a specific corpus of documents that reference a group of entities identified as the Anunnaki, figures who are consistently described as holding primordial authority. When I examine these texts, such as the lists of divine decrees known as the Mi, I find they are not simply myths. They appear to function as cosmological charters, laying out a framework for cosmic order and defining the fundamental principles that govern the civilized world. These documents delineate a clear hierarchy of authority. A supreme council, often headed by deities like Anu or Enlil, is depicted making foundational decisions about the structure of reality. This establishes a top-down model of command that originates from a non-human source. A central theme in texts like the Atrahasis is the specific allocation of tasks to newly created human populations. Humanity's purpose is explicitly defined: to perform the labor of the gods, to maintain the canals, and to supply the temples, thereby relieving the divine of their burdens. This textual framework extends beyond simple labor. It details the organization of society itself, assigning specific functions and crafts to human communities. The texts essentially provide a blueprint for a functioning state, complete with its divisions of labor and its ritual obligations. My investigation then turns to the accounts of city foundations. The Sumerian tradition, particularly in texts like the Eridu Genesis, describes the establishment of the first cities, such as Eridu, Bad Tibira, and Larak, as a deliberate act carried out by these divine agents before human kingship existed. Each of these primordial cities is textually linked to a specific patron deity. The authority of a settlement and its subsequent rulers appears to derive directly from its initial founding by a non-human entity, who establishes the city's main temple as a center of cosmic power on Earth. What emerges from this analysis is not a random collection of stories, but a highly structured symbolic system. This system creates an ideological map that is superimposed directly onto the physical geography of Mesopotamia, assigning meaning and legitimacy to specific locations. This textual tradition, therefore, appears to function as a technology of territorial control. The narrative of divine city founding provides a powerful justification for the political preeminence of ancient centers like Uruk or Ur. Their authority is not just historical, but cosmological. A critical question arises from this juxtaposition. If the physical record shows a world of constant collapse and reorganization, what is the function of a textual record that insists on an unbroken chain of authority, one established at the very beginning of time by divine founders? When I juxtapose the archaeological evidence of systemic breaks with the textual narrative of primordial order, the central investigative task becomes one of structural correlation. I must determine if there is a formal relationship between the cycle of material collapse and the framework of cosmic authority. My analysis begins by isolating the narrative cycles present in the mythological records. In texts like the Atrahasis epic, I observe a recurring sequence. A period of divine order is established, a catastrophic event threatens this stability, and a new world is subsequently restarted on revised principles. This same tripartite structure appears to be mirrored in the physical strata of sites like Uruk. A layer representing a stable urban phase corresponds to the period of order. An archaeologically distinct destruction or abandonment layer marks the catastrophe, followed by a new settlement layer signifying the restart. Placing these two datasets in parallel reveals a striking correspondence. A pattern of foundation, followed by a catastrophic interruption and culminating in a deliberate refoundation, seems to be a fundamental element shared by both the material and the symbolic records. This cyclical model does not appear to be a mere coincidence. It suggests a core structural component for organizing both historical and mythological time. The past is not framed as a linear progression, but as a series of worlds, each built upon the remnants of the one that came before it. The Sumerian king list provides a clear textual articulation of this principle. It explicitly divides its sequence of rulers with a great flood, creating a definitive rupture between an antediluvian past and a post-diluvian present. This is the collapse and restart model applied directly to political history. What this pattern highlights is the function of the prior domain described in the foundation texts. The era of the Anunnaki and the divine establishment of cities like Eridu serves as the immutable blueprint for civilization, an ideal order that exists before the first cycle of collapse. The critical function of this model then becomes apparent. Each restart, each new social structure that emerges from the archaeological ruins is not presented as a novel invention. It is framed as a restoration of that original perfect order which was temporarily lost. This insight forces a methodological shift. The textual tradition may not be a simple chronicle, but a sophisticated mechanism for managing the memory of collapse. It provides an ideological toolkit that allows cultural continuity to persist, even when material continuity is broken. The identification of this shared pattern raises a crucial question. If the cycle of collapse and restoration is a primary cultural technology, how does this mechanism influence the way in which authority is constructed and legitimized in each new iteration of the civilized world? While this cyclical pattern provides a powerful explanatory model, it also generates a significant structural conflict. A deep disalignment becomes visible when I compare the symbolic narratives of divine agency with the functional evidence of what is happening on the ground during these periods of change. The core of this tension lies in the nature of causation. The textual tradition, particularly in its earlier Sumerian forms, points to direct personal agency. It names specific entities, the Anunnaki, Enlil, Enki, as the deliberate architects of cities, social order, and catastrophic events like the flood. The archaeological record, however, suggests a different causality. The evidence from sites like Tel Brak in Syria or the urban centers of southern Mesopotamia indicates impersonal, systemic processes. The layers of collapse point toward climate change, resource depletion, or internal social friction, not the single act of a named deity. This disalignment intensifies when I trace the evolution of these narratives over time. As I examine later Akkadian and Babylonian versions of these foundation stories, I observe a consistent pattern of editorial reorganization. The scribes are not just copying older Sumerian material, they are actively reinterpreting it. A clear example is the Babylonian epic Enuma Elish, which co-opts and subordinates earlier Sumerian cosmological figures to elevate the patron god of Babylon, Marduk. This continuous curation of memory appears to be a mechanism designed to reinforce the legitimacy of the current political order. What I find most significant in this textual evolution is a gradual shift away from direct personal agents and toward abstract functional systems. The narrative focus subtly moves from the god who physically built a city to the concept of divinely ordained kingship as an enduring institution. This suggests that the primary concern was not historical accuracy about a founding event, but the preservation of functional continuity. The system of governance, the rituals of the temple, the techniques of canal maintenance, these are presented as permanent structures, inherited from a distant past. The narrative logic transforms. Instead of a story about the replacement of one divine ruler with another, it becomes a story about the restoration of a pre-existing ideal order. The specific agents become less important than the eternal blueprint they supposedly established at the beginning of time. This focus on functional continuity provides an incredibly resilient ideological tool. It allows any new power that rises from the ashes of a collapse, whether it be Akkadian, Babylonian, or otherwise, to legitimize itself not as an inventor of a new system, but as the rightful heir to an ancient one. The textual record, therefore, doesn't just manage the memory of collapse, it transforms it. A traumatic rupture in the material world is reframed as a necessary purification, a prelude to the re-establishment of the correct and original cosmic principles that were temporarily lost. This creates a profound methodological problem for my investigation. The disalignment between text and archaeology is not a simple contradiction to be resolved. It appears to be a deliberate and functional feature of the ideological system itself, a technology for ensuring societal resilience. My line of inquiry must therefore shift. The question is no longer simply about the conflict between two different types of evidence. It is about understanding the sophisticated archival and scribal practices that were developed to construct and maintain this very disalignment. This forces a profound methodological shift in my investigation. The disalignment between the textual and archaeological records no longer appears to be a simple contradiction that needs to be resolved. It seems to be a deliberately constructed and highly functional feature of the ideological system itself. My analysis must therefore pivot from asking what these documents say about the past to what they were engineered to do in the present in which they were written and curated. The central object of my inquiry becomes the function of the record, not just its content. From this juxtaposition of successive organizational layers, a core hypothesis emerges: the concept of an inherited world. This does not appear as an ontological claim about the nature of reality, but rather as a structural consequence of how the available records are organized. The idea of inheritance seems to function as a powerful technology for explaining and ensuring the persistence of complex systems across periods of profound societal collapse. It provides a conceptual bridge over the material ruptures that I observe in the strata of Uruk and Eridu. This insight redirects my entire investigative focus. The key site of analysis is no longer just the archaeological dig or the mythological narrative in isolation. It is the ancient archive itself, the scribal institution where textual authority was forged, transferred, and reinterpreted. I must now examine the specific scribal practices that construct this continuity. My work turns to the mechanics of how authority is textually transferred, for instance, in the careful editing of the Sumerian king list, or the recontextualization of divine decrees, the me, for new political purposes. This leads me to conceptualize the cuneiform record as possessing its own form of stratigraphy. I'm looking at documentary strata, layers of copying, commentary, and redaction that accumulate over centuries, each one adapting the inherited past to serve the institutional needs of the present. The central tension of my investigation is therefore relocated. It is no longer a simple conflict between a text and a potsherd. It is now the internal tension within the archive itself, the friction between the ideological claim of perfect preservation and the observable reality of constant pragmatic reinterpretation. What this suggests is that the archive was not a passive repository of information. It appears to have functioned as an active engine for manufacturing consent and legitimizing power. The scribal class emerges not as mere chroniclers, but as the architects of this durable ideological framework. A new line of questioning therefore opens up. If the narrative of an inherited world is a textual technology designed to manage the trauma of collapse, what were the specific archival techniques used to construct it? My focus must now turn to the archive as a mechanism for producing reality. This brings my investigation back to the stratified layers of Eridu and Uruk. These are not merely records of societal collapse. From this new perspective, they appear as evidence of catastrophic information loss, where the complex data embedded in a living society is almost entirely erased. The archive's function, then, appears even more critical. It seems to operate as a mechanism for preserving a core set of instructions, a kind of civilizational operating system designed to survive these recurring data loss events and enable a reboot on a new physical substrate. This reframes the entire problem. The central conflict is no longer a simple discrepancy between a material record and a textual one. It is a more fundamental tension between the violent degradation of physical information and the engineered persistence of symbolic functional information. With this understanding, I must re-examine the figures named in the earliest records, the Anunnaki. If the primary function of the archive is to transmit a blueprint for restarting civilization, what does this imply about the nature of these primordial agents who authored it? A new possibility emerges. The term Anunnaki may not refer to historical individuals or even to gods in a strictly religious sense. It could function as a technical designation for the source of this core informational package itself, the fundamental principles of social and cosmic order. Their role in the narrative is therefore transformed. They cease to be simple founders who acted once in a distant past. Instead, they become the symbolic name given to the set of resilient instructions that allow for a societal restart after a complete systemic failure. This opens an entirely new and more profound layer for my investigation. If this is the case, the great Mesopotamian scribal project was not simply an exercise in history, theology, or political propaganda. It was a multi-millennial effort in applied information theory. The next phase of my work, therefore, cannot be to ask who the Anunnaki were. The more urgent question is, what is the specific structure of the information they are said to have bequeathed? My focus must now turn to deconstructing this civilizational code itself.